Ladies and gentlemen of the press, welcome. It is good to be back in Nairobi, and I thank the Kenyan government and people for their warm welcome. The chief executives of the UN system are gathering here for an important meeting, and this is yet another demonstration of Kenya's vital place regionally and globally. And this is a vital time as we look at the unfolding crisis in the region, especially in Sudan, a situation that is deeply concerning as it grows worse by the day. Khartoum is in turmoil. Darfur is burning once again. And the UN Refugee Agency has already affirmed that more than 100,000 people have fled and 800,000 people might flee the country in the coming days and weeks. The fighting needs to stop, and to stop now, before more people die and this conflict explodes into an all-out war that could affect the region for years to come. All parties must put the interests of the Sudanese people first, and that means peace, a return to civilian rule, allowing for the development of the country. We are putting these goals front and center as we engage with the parties to the conflict and work hand in hand with the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD. The Sudanese are facing a humanitarian catastrophe. Hospitals destroyed, humanitarian warehouses looted, millions facing food insecurity. And I echo President William Ruto's strong calls for the parties to de-escalate tensions, return to the negotiating table, and agree on a lasting ceasefire. In the meantime, the United Nations is ready to deliver for the Sudanese people under the leadership of my Special Representative, Volker Perthes. And the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, is now in Sudan to help ensure the continued flow of humanitarian assistance. Aid must be allowed into Sudan, and we need secure and immediate access to be able to distribute it to people who need it most. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected, and humanitarian workers and assets must be respected. I call on the international community to support the Sudanese people in their pursuit for peace and the return to democratic transition. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, Africa is a place of enormous natural, human, cultural, and entrepreneurial richness. The African Union is a close and valued partner of the United Nations, from peace building and peacekeeping to our joint efforts to deliver Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda. The recent ceasefire in Libya, the peace agreement in Central African Republic are a cause for optimism. And I salute Kenya's leadership role in the peace processes in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia. Last month, I visited Somalia, where I saw important progress in the fight against terrorism, bolstered by the African Union Transition Mission there. And on Saturday, I will attend in Burundi the meeting of the Regional Oversight Mechanism to discuss peace and security in the DRC and the region. Step by step, we are seeing African leadership working to solve African problems. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, the 21st century should be Africa's century, but a series of historic and economic injustices stand in the way. The COVID-19 pandemic slowed and even reversed strong economic growth across the continent. The global cost of living crisis, made worse by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has sent food and energy prices soaring. Climate chaos that Africans did very little to cause is creating floods, hunger, and deadly droughts. And the dysfunctional and unjust global financial system denies many African countries the debt relief and the concessional funding they need. Africa is doubly victimized. First, by the scars of colonialism that linger to this day. And second, by the injustice of the post-World War II era, when global institutions, from the United Nations to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created. And at the time, the decolonization of Africa had yet to get underway, and so African countries were practically not present, and to this day remain clearly underrepresented. The same applies to correct one of the biggest injustices in international peace and security architecture, the absence of any permanent seat on the Security Council for the African continent. This must be remedied. Ladies and gentlemen, I've made it my mission to stand with developing countries in their pursuit for justice. First, financial justice. Last year, the International Monetary Fund allocated $650 billion in special drawing rights, or SDRs, to boost liquidity during crises. This is money created out of nothing. The countries of the European Union received a total of $160 billion in SDRs, while African countries, with 3 times the population, received just $34 billion. This is an absurdity. We need deep reforms to the global financial system so that Africa is represented at the highest level and the needs of developing countries are at the heart of all policies and decisions. And I've called for an SDG stimulus package of at least $500 billion per year to scale up affordable long-term financing for developing countries. Second, climate justice. African countries are leading the way on climate. I commend President Ruto's commitment to transition to 100% clean energy by 2030, South Africa's Just Transition Energy Partnership, Egypt and Nigeria's energy transition plans, and the EU's ambitious green stimulus program. These massive efforts need massive support. And so developed countries must deliver on the $100 billion a year promised to developing countries and the Loss and Damage Fund agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh. I have proposed the Climate Solidarity Pact, in which developed countries provide financial and technical support to help emerging economies in Africa and beyond to promote the just transition to renewable energy. Third, Africa needs the justice that only peace can bring. The United Nations will continue working to prevent and diffuse the conflict that plague the continent. I've called consistently for a new generation of robust peace enforcement missions and counter-terrorism operations led by the African Union with the UN Security Council mandate and the Chapter 7 of the Charter and with guaranteed funding, namely through assessed contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, once again I am pleased to be back in Kenya, and the United Nations stands with Africa. And I will not relent in the quest for peace, prosperity, and global justice for all the people of this great continent. Thank you.
Thank you. First question to Elizabeth Atiendo from TV 47.
Elizabeth Atiendo from TV 47. Good evening. My first question is on climate justice.
On?
Climate crisis. Yes. So you recently said that climate change is a story of reckless injustice and greed, but there is still a story of hope. What is that silver lining in this whole climate crisis? For instance, in Kenya, we are battling the worst drought in 40 years, and currently we have the floods. How will you assure those Kenyans that there is a story of hope in all this? Thank you.
First of all, it is absolutely essential to change course. And governments, but also the private sector, namely the energy sector and others that contribute to climate change, they need to dramatically reduce emissions in the present decade. Without the dramatic reduction of emissions in the present decade, we will see Kenya and we will see the African continent with an acceleration of the droughts, of the floods, and other natural catastrophes that are undermining the possibilities of development and causing an enormous suffering. But in many cases, climate change is already there. And so it is essential that the promises that were made in order to strengthen the financing of adaptation, which means building resilience of communities, of infrastructure, to be able to better resist to the impacts of climate change, it is absolutely essential that the financing of adaptation is dramatically increased. There was a promise in Sharm el-Sheikh to double it, in Glasgow to double it. We are not yet there. Our belief is that 50% of climate finance should be to adaptation. And in Sharm el-Sheikh, we decided to create a loss and damage fund. It's not yet operational. It is supposed to be operational during the next COP, but it is an essential contribution to support countries like Kenya that are facing the dramatic impact of climate change without having contributed much to it.